Hello and welcome to the channel Echoes Shadows. 3 campsites, 3 ordinary nights until the supernatural appeared. Get ready for real stories that will make you think twice before returning to nature. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming stories. Thank you very much. Story 1: Shadows in the Forest.
I've always been a fan of outdoor adventures. Growing up in Flagstaff, Arizona, surrounded by forests and mountains, I was used to spending weekends hiking and camping. As an adult, it became my escape from the daily grind of working in a logistics office. So when I suggested to my girlfriend Emily that we go camping in the Grand Canyon National Park, it seemed like the perfect weekend getaway. But this one was different. It still haunts me. It was a regular Friday afternoon when we left our apartment. We had packed all our camping gear, tent, flashlights, food, everything we'd need for 2 days in the wilderness. Emily, more of a city girl at heart, was a bit hesitant about camping in such a remote place, but she agreed because, in her words, "We need some time away from the city." It sounded perfect. Clear skies, cool mountain air, and isolation from the world. Just the two of us. We arrived at the park around 4 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. The area was beautiful, with towering trees and endless views of the canyon. We hiked for about an hour to reach a more secluded spot, far from the main camping areas. It was a clearing surrounded by trees, perfect for setting up our tent. As I set up the tent, everything seemed peaceful, but there was a strange feeling in the air. That kind of unsettling silence you only notice when everything gets too quiet. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the normal quiet of the wilderness. Emily didn't say much, but I could tell she was feeling uneasy too. As dusk turned to night, we lit a small campfire and sat down to eat. That's when the first strange thing happened. I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was just an animal moving through the trees, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate. It sounded like someone was walking around our campsite. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. "Do you hear that?" I asked Emily. "Probably just an animal," she said, but her voice wavered. I wasn't so sure. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt heavier, like something was watching us from the shadows. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. We finished our meal and climbed into the tent, hoping to get some rest. I was tired from the hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night was still, too still, and the only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then around midnight, there was a loud thud against the side of the tent. Emily shot up, terrified. "What was that?" I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. Again, there was nothing. Just the cold, quiet night. But the tent had definitely been hit by something or someone. I walked around looking for any signs of movement, but there was nothing, not even a breeze. When I came back into the tent, the temperature had dropped drastically. It was freezing, even though the weather forecast had predicted mild temperatures. Emily looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I felt something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something touched me. It was cold, like ice." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" She lifted her arm, pointing to where she said she had felt the touch. Her skin was clammy, and I could see goosebumps running down her arm. "I don't know, but I swear something touched me," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen anything outside, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. Whatever was happening wasn't just in our heads. Hours passed, but neither of us could sleep. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and every now and then, we would hear footsteps circling our tent. They were soft but distinct, like someone slowly pacing around us. I grabbed my flashlight again, shined it outside, but once again, nothing. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the tent started to shake violently. It was like something or someone was grabbing the sides, trying to pull it down. Emily screamed, and I grabbed her arm, yanking her out of the tent. As soon as we got out, the shaking stopped. But when I looked around the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure, a shadowy silhouette, unmoving. It was hard to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't human. The way it stood, the way it stared, it was all wrong. "Emily, we need to go," I whispered, barely able to contain the terror in my voice. She didn't argue. We grabbed what we could and bolted into the night, not caring about the trail, just desperate to get away. The figure didn't follow us, but I could feel its presence lingering behind, watching us as we fled. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot near the entrance of the park. By then, the sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the ground. We threw our gear into the car and drove off without looking back. Neither of us spoke the entire drive home. What could we say? We knew what we had experienced was real, and we both felt the same. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with us. Since that night, I haven't been able to camp. Every time someone suggests a trip to the wilderness, I make up an excuse. I can't go back there, not after what happened. Something is out there in the Grand Canyon, and I never want to meet it again.
Story 2. The night that changed our lives.
I've always loved camping. That feeling of freedom, being far from the chaos of the city, the constant noise and the lights that never dim. My friends share the same passion. So when I suggested a camping trip by a river in the backwoods of North Carolina, no one hesitated. John, my best friend since childhood, was excited. Luke and Rachel, an inseparable couple, were thrilled as well, and Emma, who wasn't the biggest fan of camping, agreed to come along so she wouldn't feel left out. We left Charlotte on a Friday afternoon, all hyped for 2 days of complete disconnection. The place we picked was near a small town called Linville. The area was surrounded by dense woods and, of course, a calm river with crystal clear water that gently flowed, almost inviting us to stay. We arrived at night, set up our tents by the river, and lit a fire. The weather was perfect, stars shining above, the sound of the water flowing, and that sense of peace that only nature can provide. We ate, laughed, and talked about our daily lives. None of us had any idea of what was about to happen. It was around midnight when we started hearing a strange noise, something different from the constant sound of the river or the animals in the woods. It was like a whistle, but not a normal one. It was long, almost like a distant wail. "Did you guys hear that?" Emma asked, looking around. Her eyes already showed a hint of fear. "It's probably just the wind," I replied, trying to stay calm. But the sound continued, and the more we paid attention, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It seemed to be coming from some point in the woods, but also felt close. Luke stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked a bit to see if he could find anything. When he pointed the light toward the trees, that's when we saw it for the first time. Among the trees there was a figure, tall, thin, completely still. We couldn't see its face, but the outline was clear. It was like it was watching us, standing there without making a sound. "Who's there?" Luke shouted, but the figure didn't respond or move. A chill ran down my spine. The air around the fire felt heavier, as if something invisible was closing in on us. "Let's get inside the tents," I suggested, trying to ignore the growing fear. We all crawled into the larger tent, hoping it would make us feel safer. But as soon as the silence fell again, we heard something outside. Footsteps, slowly circling our tents. It was like someone was walking around, dragging their feet on the ground. The sound was agonizing, repetitive, and the tension in the air became unbearable. Suddenly, a loud thud, as if something heavy had fallen on our tent. John screamed in fear, and Emma was already sobbing. When we finally mustered the courage to step outside and see what was happening, what we saw was worse than anything we imagined. The other tent, where we had stored our belongings, was on fire. Flames were rising high, and on the other side, near the trees, stood the same figure from before. But this time, it wasn't alone. 3 other figures appeared around it, all motionless, watching us with that oppressive presence. "Run! Run to the river!" I yelled as we grabbed what we could and dashed toward the water. But we didn't get far. As we ran, I felt a strong pull on my leg, as if something invisible had grabbed my ankle. I fell hard to the ground, feeling sharp pain. When I looked down, I saw 3 deep scratches on my ankle, claw marks, but there was nothing there. "Help me!" I screamed to John, who ran over and lifted me up. When I looked at the others, I saw Rachel on the ground, trembling, tears streaming down her face. Something scratched me too, she stammered, her shirt stained with blood on her arms. Luke was trying to hold her, but he was in shock. The figures that had been in the woods were now closer, almost touching the circle of light our fire provided. Emma was panicking, unsure of what to do, while John grabbed anything that could be used as a weapon. But nothing seemed useful against them. They were shadows, presences that were there but weren't of this world. That's when the worst happened. A strong wind came out of nowhere, blowing ashes and sparks in all directions, and the figures began to move toward us, slowly but menacingly. The temperature plummeted, and the fire went out in an instant, leaving us in total darkness. All we could hear were whispers. They came from all directions, as if hundreds of voices were speaking at once, distant but intense. It felt like something was trying to drive us mad. With no other option, we ran into the river. We plunged into the freezing water, hoping it would protect us somehow. We stayed there shivering, watching as the figures stood on the shore, as if they couldn't reach us. We stayed there for hours, too scared to return to the campsite. Time seemed to stand still. When daylight finally started to break, the figures disappeared, as did the whispers. We returned to what was left of our camp. The tent was burned, our belongings destroyed, and the ground around was covered in strange marks, like something had been dragged across it. Without saying a word, we packed up what little we had left and left the place. We never talked about it among ourselves, but we all carry the scars from that night. Even now, years later, I still feel the weight of those figures' gaze. I still feel the marks on my ankle, and I know that if I ever go back to those woods, they'll be there, waiting.
Story 3. The Night We Couldn't Move.
I've always loved camping, and when the idea of a trip to a remote part of the Midwest came up, I knew it would be an unforgettable adventure. The region we chose was near a small town called Clearview, a place known for its wide open spaces and quiet, remote nature. It was perfect for getting away from city life. The group was small, just 5 of us. Me, Matt, my best friend since high school, his girlfriend Amanda, Jack and Emily, a couple who always joined us on any outdoor adventure. And then there was Max, Matt's big, energetic dog, who never missed a trip. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The place was incredible, surrounded by rolling hills and a small lake that mirrored the sky. We set up our tents under the shade of some trees, far enough from the lake to avoid any overnight chills. The day was spent exploring. Nothing seemed out of place. But as evening approached, the air grew unexpectedly cold. A strange, almost eerie quiet settled over the area, and what had been peaceful suddenly felt unsettling. We made a fire, gathered around it, and had dinner. Max lay by the fire, warming up and resting after a day of running around. But as the night wore on, something changed. Max, who was usually calm, began to growl, staring into the woods with an intensity that made my stomach drop. We all turned to see what he was looking at, but there was nothing. Maybe Max isn't a fan of the woods after all, Matt joked, trying to ease the tension. We all laughed nervously, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind picked up, carrying a weight with it, and the silence around us felt oppressive. We decided it was best to head to our tents and get some rest. That's when it all started. I woke up in the middle of the night. The fire had burned out and it was pitch black, but the darkness wasn't the problem. It was the fact that I couldn't move. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to respond. The only thing I could do was move my eyes, darting around the inside of the tent, desperate for an explanation. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I wasn't the only one. I glanced to my side and saw Matt lying there, eyes wide open, filled with terror. He couldn't move either. We were both trapped, awake but completely paralyzed. And that's when I saw them. Figures standing around the tent, shadows that didn't seem to belong to anything. They didn't have faces, but their shapes were unmistakable. I could feel their presence, the weight of their gaze even though they didn't have eyes. And the worst part was, I knew they were watching us. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Max, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly started howling. It wasn't his usual bark. It was a sound of pure fear. Outside, the shadows moved closer to him, and I could see through the gap in the tent that he was trying to back away. But something was keeping him there, holding him in place. He began to thrash, growling and barking in desperation, but it was no use. The shadows closed in around him, and we were helpless, unable to do anything but watch. I glanced at Matt, and I could see the same panic in his eyes. We were all awake, but frozen, completely powerless. Amanda, in the tent next to ours, tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could hear her breathing heavily, could hear the faint rustle of her trying to move, but she was just as stuck as the rest of us. The figures outside began to come closer to us. They didn't walk, they just moved, like they were floating, and one of them stopped right at the entrance of our tent. The air around us dropped to an unnatural cold, the kind that doesn't come from the weather, but from something much darker. And then I started hearing the whispers. They were faint, unintelligible, but I could tell they were communicating with each other, planning, deciding what to do next. Suddenly, one of the shadows reached out and touched Max. He jumped as if he'd been shocked, and for a moment he was completely still, staring off into the distance before he started running in circles around the camp, barking like crazy. And then, as quickly as it had come, the paralysis lifted. My body was mine again. Without thinking, I yelled, and Matt did too. We all burst out of the tents, running blindly into the night. Max was still running in circles, completely freaked out. When I looked back, I saw the figures vanish, as if they had never been there at all. What did they want? I'll never know. But what happened that night wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. We waited until morning to return to the campsite, terrified of what we might find. When we did, the tents were untouched, but Max was gone. We searched for him for hours, but he was nowhere to be found. The dog that had never left Matt's side was gone, and I couldn't blame him. Since that night, I haven't been back to the woods. The legends of the Midwest have never made more sense to me than they do now. So if you ever decide to camp out here, remember, no matter how safe it seems, something might be watching you.